Here is the placenta fully formed, and this is part of the umbilical cord. It's cut off. It would be going to the fetus here. And if you recall from our circulatory system chapter, there are two umbilical arteries, and they are blue because they're deoxygenated. And these come off of one from each internal iliac artery from the fetus. And they come out and they kind of twirl around the outside here. They go out and they pick up oxygen as well as nutrients, and they drop off wastes as well as CO2, which is just a gaseous waste. And then they come back through a single umbilical vein, which will come back and ultimately dump into the inferior vena cava and go back to the heart. In addition to serving as the site of exchange for gases as well as nutrients and waste, the placenta is also the site of a lot of hormone production. It produces human chorionic gonadotropin, which maintains that corpus luteum, which keeps secreting progesterone and makes sure we maintain this lining of the endometrium. It also produces human placental lactogen, which helps the mammary glands begin to prepare for milk production. It produces relaxin, which is a hormone that relaxes the pubic symphysis and causes dilation of the cervix, and this is going to make pushing of the baby out of the vaginal canal a lot easier. And it also produces progesterone and estrogens. So it eventually, as it gets bigger, will take over from the corpus luteum the production of progesterone as well as estrogen. And eventually, the ratio of progesterone and estrogen will switch. Instead of being mostly progesterone, it'll be mostly estrogen. And that's one of the things that stimulates the beginning of labor, of that positive feedback system that is labor. We've talked about a lot of processes already. We've talked about fertilization, where the egg and the sperm come together to form a zygote. And then from the zygote, we've talked about cleavage, where you take that single cell zygote and chop it into a bunch of different blastomere cells. And eventually it'll become a solid ball of cells called a morula. And then it continues going through division, and that morula will hollow out and become a hollow ball of cells called a blastocyst. And then at some point, a band of those cells in the inner cell mass of the blastocyst begins undergoing gastrulation, and that's what will become ultimately the embryo. And gastrulation is where you take those cells and you differentiate into three germ layers: endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm. And it's at that point, after gastrulation, that you become an embryo. An embryo has those three germ layers. Well, it's shortly after that that you begin another process that's important in development called organogenesis. And organogenesis is exactly what it sounds like. It's the process of organ formation. And the very beginning of this involves a groove that forms in the ectoderm. And that groove will ultimately fold and form a tube. And this is called the neural plate, and these neural folds. And the part of that up the front will develop into the brain, and the rest will develop into the spinal cord. And here you can see this groove. And this groove, again, it begins to form a groove, then the walls eventually come together, and it forms a tube. These folds become a tube. And then up here, part of the tube thickens and becomes this neural plate, which will ultimately become the brain. The rest of this will become the spinal cord, and the rest of your nervous system will grow from there. The beginnings of that nervous system start after a couple of weeks, and by week 4, the circulatory system is beginning to develop. You have a heart beating at week 4. And these two systems are very important because the nervous system helps govern what's going on in your body, and the circulatory system is providing a flow of blood so that you can get energy and oxygen to the different parts of your developing body. And so those are two systems that it's really important have to begin developing early. And then in week 6, the placenta is formed, and which means you're getting more nutrients from mom's blood. You're starting to grow longer limbs. The embryo is now floating in the amniotic cavity, and you're beginning to form some skull bones around the early developing brain. Here's what you look like around week 4. Again, you can see the beginning of the heart, atria and ventricles that are developing, as well as you've got a tail forming at the end of the spinal cord. And by 6 weeks, the tail is shrinking and the placenta is a little bit more formed, as is the umbilical cord, and the skull is beginning to take more shape. And at the end of the first trimester, you're tiny, but you begin to look a little bit more human. Again, the rudiments of most of your systems are already there, and things are beginning to take shape. By the middle of the second trimester, you're going to start to feel some movement because the musculoskeletal systems are beginning to function. Hair is beginning to grow. The cerebral hemispheres in the brain are starting to enlarge a little bit. And there's just a lot of growth. By the end of the second trimester, we're at like 1.5 pounds almost. And during the third trimester, these systems are coming online for normal function. The rate of growth slows a little bit, but in terms of absolute growth, you get a lot of weight gain, right? Because a smaller percentage of a bigger starting weight is a bigger absolute weight. And so because the baby is bigger at the start of the third trimester, a smaller percentage gain means you're noticing it, though, a lot more than you were earlier. And by the end of the third trimester, you're big, right? The fetus is really, really large. And this is one of those late trimester 3D ultrasounds. My wife is pregnant right now, and we were supposed to get her ultrasound done last week, and so I was holding off because I was going to pop our kids on here, but we had to get it delayed, so this is the random one from the book. Sometimes humans have more than one child at a time, and we call this twins, or sometimes triplets or quadruplets, etc. And there are two main ways to be twins. You can be dizygotic or monozygotic. And dizygotic essentially means just that mom happened to ovulate 2 eggs that month. And this is not all that uncommon. And then dad's sperm happened to make their way to both eggs and fertilize both of them. And so you have 2 different babies that are genetically just as different as any other siblings. They just happen to be sharing the womb at the same time, but they've got their own placentas, and they were formed as 2 separate zygotes. Monozygotic twins were 1 egg and 1 sperm that came together, but early on in cleavage, during those first couple of cleavage divisions, they broke apart. But it was early enough that we talked about differentiation of cells, like that ball rolling down the hill. The ball really hadn't rolled down the hill much, and so all of those cells still retained the ability to become any sort of cell in the body, and they did. So they break apart, and both of those pieces end up developing into entire people. And so you came from a single zygote, you are monozygotic twins, and also you are genetically identical because you came from the same sperm, the same egg, the same zygote, and so you're clones of one another. Identical twins are clones. That they're not exactly alike, right? And that shows you that genes aren't everything, right? But they're an awful lot alike. Being pregnant is difficult, so it seems, and so my wife tells me all the time. The mom has to absorb enough nutrients and oxygen and vitamins, not only for herself, but also the fetus, and she also has to get rid of waste for the fetus. So you're not only eating and breathing for 2, you're also peeing for 2. And so you're going to gain weight, not just because of the weight of the fetus, but all the extra tissue you need to surround the fetus, all the extra blood that you need to support the fetus. And so it requires a lot more energy to maintain this balance, not just homeostatic balance, but also your physical balance, right? Your center of gravity is different. And you used to have organs where that baby is, and so they all get shoved out of the way into a weird position. This is what your abdominal cavity typically looks like, and this is what it looks like when you are 9 months pregnant. And clearly, all of your intestines have gotten shoved up to the top, as has your stomach, as has your liver, and so you can be forgiven if you have a little indigestion while you're pregnant. Also, this pushes up on your diaphragm, which pushes up on your lungs and makes it much harder to breathe. Again, your center of gravity is off. You're pulling on your back. Your back can be sore. It's just seems difficult. So very broadly, this is what's happening to your body. Your respiratory rate and tidal volume have to increase because you need more oxygen. Also, it's harder to breathe because, again, your diaphragm is being pushed up, and your thoracic cavity is harder to make big, harder to expand. Your blood volume is going to increase by half. And your nutrient requirements are going to go up by almost a third. And because your blood volume goes up by a half, your glomerular filtration rate goes up by half. Your kidneys are being taxed, and you're going to have to pee more. You're making more blood, which means you're making more urine, and the baby's sitting on your bladder, which means your bladder can't get as full. And my wife, last time she was pregnant, sometimes she would have to really pee at the end of her pregnancy, and then she would just wait. She wouldn't go if it was, because sometimes the baby would shift positions, and then she wouldn't have to go anymore. Your mammary glands are fully developed by the end of the second trimester, and so you're going to have much larger breasts. And the uterus is going to expand by an incredible amount, mostly because the existing cells are just going to get larger. So at some point, you're going to want to get this kid out, and that is labor and delivery. And labor begins by spontaneous contractions of the smooth muscles. And this begins a positive feedback system. Stretching of the uterus can cause an increase in the rate of those contractions. So early on in the pregnancy, there's a lot of progesterone that tends to inhibit contractions, and a little bit of estrogen. And eventually, those hormones begin to reverse in their ratio, and that amount of estrogen helps stimulate this stuff to start. Now, false labor is spasms in the uterine muscles that are not regular, not persistent. These are sometimes called Braxton Hicks contractions. This does not mean you're going to go into labor. It just happens sometimes when you're very, very pregnant. True labor begins with a positive feedback system of events that is not reversible. Once it starts, it's going to go through to completion. And here you can see where the baby's sitting toward the end. They kind of drop to where their head is sitting right on the cervix, which is already starting to dilate itself. The placenta is going to be the cause of this rising estrogen, and estrogen helps stimulate labor because it makes your muscle cells in your uterus, in the myometrium, more sensitive to oxytocin, and oxytocin stimulates contractions. Placenta is also secreting relaxin, which relaxes the pelvic articulations, those joints, dilates the cervix. And the fetus is just getting bigger, it's heavier, it sits further down, and it physically stretches the myometrium, especially at the cervix. And that stretching secretes oxytocin, causes you to secrete oxytocin. Oxytocin, which you're now more sensitive because of the estrogen, causes you to have contractions, which pushes the baby down more, which causes more stretching of the cervix, which causes more oxytocin to be secreted, which causes more contraction, which pushes the baby down harder and harder and harder, and eventually it keeps going until that initial stimulus, meaning the baby sitting there on your cervix, is gone. We think of labor as just delivering the baby, but there are really three main stages of labor. There's dilation, because if the cervix does not dilate, labor is going to be awfully difficult. Expulsion, which is when the baby actually comes out, what we think of as delivery. And the third stage is the placental stage. You also have to deliver the placenta from your body. Once true labor begins, dilation is going to begin. So the fetus shifts toward the cervical canal. Your cervix, which is normally very, very small, begins to dilate up to eventually 10 centimeters. Why 10 centimeters? Well, because 10 centimeters happens to be about the size of a baby's head. And this can last 8 hours or sometimes far more. And the contractions are going to be beginning during this, and eventually they'll last up to 30 seconds, and they'll be occurring every 10 minutes or so. The duration and the frequency and the intensity is going to increase. Eventually, the amnion is also going to rupture. And this is what we call having your water break. And it's pretty noticeable if it happens. And here you can see the cervix dilating at the first stage of labor. Once the cervix is fully dilated at 10 centimeters, those involuntary contractions of the myometrium will reach full intensity. Mom will start voluntarily pushing as well, and this usually lasts less than a couple of hours, and then delivery occurs when the baby comes out. Here you can see delivery occurring. The baby's head is now out, which is the hardest part, and the rest happens pretty quickly. And the last stage, placental stage, is when the placenta, which is made from the baby's tissue, not the mom's, has to get pushed out. You tear the connections between the placenta and mom's endometrium, which means there's usually a lot of blood and fluid. Mom's uterus will continue contracting after the placental stage to compress the uterine blood so you don't lose as much blood. And here's a diagram from your book of the placenta exiting the vaginal canal after the baby already has. And again, this uterus still contracting to restrict blood loss.